is Jermaine, and this is the Drowsy Podcast. Welcome back for yet another episode. I thought it was time we return to The Wind and the Willows. I really enjoy reading about the marvelous and interesting characters in that book by Kenneth Grahame. How about this time we read Chapter 5, Mr. Toad. He's by far, I think, one of the most interesting and maybe comical characters of the series, and I look forward to reading that to you. Why don't you take this moment to relax, find yourself a comfortable position, a warm beverage like a cup of tea, warm milk, your favorite pillow or blanket. If you're sitting, sit back and relax. If you're going to use this story to fall asleep, that's even better. I look forward to tonight's story. Enjoy. Chapter 2, The Open Road. Next day, the water rat took Mole to visit Mr. Toad, who lived nearby in a handsome old house called Toad Hall. It was built of mellow red brick and had lawns reaching down to the river. Toad was rather rich, but not a very sensible animal. Ratty and Badger had to keep an eye on him. He was good-natured, but inclined to show off, and he was always getting into trouble. The friends found him sitting in a deck chair in the garden, looking at a road map. He had bought a gypsy caravan, painted bright yellow with green wheels. There was an old gray horse to draw it. Toad was planning his first trip and persuaded Mole and Rat to go along with him. Toad was bouncing about, full of the joys of the open road, its freedom and fresh air. Here today, and somewhere else tomorrow, across the rolling downs, he cried excitedly. The three of them set out, but before they had gone very far, disaster struck. They were walking along the country lane quite happily, leading the horse. Suddenly, a loud poop-poop was heard. A magnificent motor car, all plate glass and chromium, flashed past them, flinging out a cloud of blinding dust. Then it was gone, a speck in the distance. The poor horse was frightened and bolted. The caravan turned over and fell into the ditch. Its windows were smashed and one wheel came off. Ratty and Mole were furious. "You road hog," they shouted, shaking their fists. But Toad just sat there in the dust, a dazed look in his eyes, muttering, "Poop, poop." He did not care about the wrecked caravan. He was already thinking how marvelous it would be to drive a car. Next day, on the riverbank, everyone was talking about the latest news. "Have you heard? Toad went up to London by an early train this morning, and he has ordered, what do you think? A large and very expensive motor car." Chapter 3, The Wild Wood. The long, hot summer had ended at last. Now it was winter. Mole was sitting with Ratty on the riverbank. One cold afternoon, the Mole decided to go to the Wild Wood and visit Mr. Badger. He was the only one of Rat's friends that the Mole had not met properly, as he was not very sociable. In the winter, most animals stay at home and rest after an active summer. Some of them go to sleep for most of the time, and you cannot persuade them to do very much. So Mole knew that if he wanted to see Mr. Badger, he would have to call on him. He slipped out of Ratty's warm parlor into the open air. The sky was steely. The countryside was bare. Twigs crackled under Mole's feet. Trees took on ugly, crouching shapes. The light faded. Mole began to feel frightened. Then the faces began. Little, evil, wedge-shaped faces looking out of holes, then vanishing. Mole kept up his pace and, looking around, saw every hole with a face in it, all fixing on him. Then the whistling began, very faint and shrill, behind and then ahead of him. Mole was alone and far from help, and night was closing in. Then the pattering began. Tiny feet pursuing him, rustling through the fallen leaves. He ran and started bumping into trees. Meanwhile, Rat had discovered Mole was not at home. He saw his footprint outside, leading to the wild wood. Seizing a stout stick, he set out at a smart pace to track him. At last, he found the Mole in the shelter of an old beech tree, trembling all over, and so glad his friend had come. And then it began to snow, thick and fast. Soon a white carpet covered the ground, and all the paths and landmarks were lost. Rat and Mole made their way with difficulty through the wild wood. Then Mole fell against something hard that cut his leg. It was a door scraper. "Where there's a door scraper, there must be a door," said Ratty sensibly. Digging down, they found a doormat, and then a very solid front door with a brass plate that said Mr. Badger on it, and an old-fashioned bell pull. They tugged at it. They could hear the bell clanging a long way down. Badger took some time to come to the door, wearing his old slippers and a thick dressing gown. He was rather grumpy at first at being disturbed, but welcomed them into his fire-lit kitchen. Great smoked hams and strings of fat brown onions hung from the rafters overhead. Badger gave them a good supper, and they sat talking by the fire about Toad and his craze for motor cars. "Something would have to be done about that," said Badger, when the winter was over. In the morning, they had porridge for breakfast, with 2 young hedgehogs that had got lost on their way to school. Badger showed them all the back door out of his lair through a maze of tunnels that led to the edge of the wood. Looking back, Mole and Rat saw the wild wood, black, threatening, and grim against the snow, and made their way quickly home, safe once more on the friendly riverbank. Now we'll read Chapter 5. Mr. Toad. One bright morning in early summer, Badger kept his promise to visit Ratty and Mole. "It's time we did something about Toad," he grunted. "He's a disgrace to the neighborhood. What my old friend, his father, would have said about his doings, I don't like to think. This craze for motor cars is getting him into trouble with the police." "Yes, he's had several crashes," agreed Rat. "I hear he has ordered another new car this week." They set off for Toad Hall. Sure enough, there at the front door stood a shiny, brand new, bright red motor car. Mr. Toad, in goggles, cap, gaiters, and a huge overcoat, came swaggering down the steps, putting on his big leather driving gloves. "You're just in time for a jolly spin, you fellows," he called out cheerfully. "Oh, no, you don't," said Badger gruffly, seizing him by the scruff of the neck and marching him back into the house. Mole and Rat took off his ridiculous motor togs, and Badger gave him a good talking to. Toad refused to promise to give up driving, so they locked him in his bedroom to think it over. But cunning Toad pretended to be ill, and while they were fetching the doctor, he skipped out of the window and bounced off to the village, laughing at his own cleverness and murmuring, "Poop, poop." In the inn yard, he saw a beautiful motor car, whose owners were inside having lunch. Toad could not resist trying it out. He turned the starting handle, hopped in behind the wheel, and drove off in a cloud of white dust. As he sped along, he chanted a little song, all about how clever he was. Toad's next appearance was as a limp and miserable appearance as a prisoner in the dock at the magistrate's court. He was charged with dangerous driving, stealing a motor car, and worst of all, cheeking the police. The magistrate took a serious view and sentenced him to 20 years imprisonment. The wretched Toad was handcuffed and marched across the square to the ancient castle, with its tall towers and grim keep, guarded by men-at-arms and warders. He was dragged through the arched gateway and through courtyards where huge bloodhounds strained at their leashes. Down spiral stone staircases he went, passing the rack room and the thumbscrew room, until he reached the deepest dungeon of all. In front of the heavy nail-studded door sat an ancient jailer with a mighty bunch of keys. Toad could never hope to get out of there, for it was the best guarded prison in England. The unhappy Toad realized what a foolish animal he had been. "What has happened to the clever, popular Mr. Toad whom everybody respected?" he whimpered. "Oh, wretched animal, so justly punished." He refused all food and lay limply on his bed, fat tears rolling down his flabby cheeks. Chapter 6. Toad's Escape. The jailer's daughter was a kind young girl who was very fond of animals. She took pity on Toad and coaxed him to eat some hot buttered toast, asking him to tell her all about Toad Hall. Soon the Toad revived a little and began to puff himself up and boast about his home and his possessions. In spite of his conceit, the young girl was sorry for him. She hated to see animals shut up, so she thought of a plan to help him to escape. He was to dress in her aunt's clothes. Her aunt was a washerwoman who came to the castle once a week. She was short and stout, like Toad. She wore a long cotton dress, a shawl, and an old blue bonnet, and carried a basket full of washing. Toad did not like the idea of dressing up as a poor old woman, but in the end, he agreed to pay her some money and tie her up so that she would not get into trouble for helping him. The jailer's daughter giggled as she tied the bonnet strings under Toad's chin. "You look exactly like her," she laughed, much to Toad's annoyance. Goodbye. Be careful what you say to the sentries. There were some anxious moments as Toad set off, especially as the sentries made rude remarks. But Toad entered into the spirit of the thing, for he fancied himself as an actor. Soon he came through the prison gate into the sunlight and was free at last. He made for the railway station and was about to buy a ticket when he realized he had left his waistcoat with all his money in his cell. What could he do now? Then he spotted the engine driver cleaning down his steam engine with a handful of cotton waste. "Oh, sir," he cried, "I am a poor washerwoman who's lost her purse. How am I going to get home? And what will my little children do without me?" The kind engine driver said, "Tell you what, missus, I'll give you a ride on my footplate, and you can wash some shirts for me when you get home." Toad accepted eagerly and hopped up on the engine. They got up steam and set off. They were soon thudding away down the track with a trail of white smoke and a whooping whistle. Suddenly, the engine driver looked back. "There's another train following us down the line," he cried. "It's full of people, policemen with truncheons, plainclothesmen with bowler hats and umbrellas, prison wardens with sticks, all shouting, 'Stop, stop, stop.'" Toad fell on his knees among the coal and begged for help. "I am not a washerwoman at all," he confessed. "I am the well-known daring criminal, Mr. Toad. Please help me." The engine driver hated to see an animal hunted. "Never mind, I'll help you," he said. "When we get through this tunnel, I'll slow down, and you can jump off and hide in the wood." They piled on more coal to get up speed, and the sparks flew as they roared through the tunnel. Then they slowed down. Toad jumped off and rolled down the bank into the wood. He laughed as he saw the other train tear past, full of policemen and wardens waving their weapons and shouting, "Stop." Then he found an old tree and lay down on a bed of leaves to wait for morning. Now we'll read Chapter 8, The Further Adventures of Toad. Toad was getting nearer and nearer to home, and still had on his washerwoman's disguise. By now it was looking worse for wear. Presently he came to a towpath running alongside a canal. An old horse was plodding along it, pulling a gaily painted barge. A big stout woman sat in it, her brawny arm along the tiller. Toad saw the chance of a lift, so he told his tale of losing a purse and having to get back to children. "I'll give you a lift as far as Toad Hall," the barge woman bargained, "if you'll do my dirty washing for me." Toad had been boasting what a good washerwoman he was. The barge woman gave him a great pile of washing, some soap, and clean water in a big tub. Toad had no idea how to set about it. Soon he was puffing and blowing and rubbing and dubbing, but the clothes were no cleaner. The barge woman took a closer look at him. "You're no washerwoman," she shrieked. "You're a dirty, ugly Toad. Get off my nice, clean barge." Toad was so annoyed, he jumped off the barge, undid the tow rope, and rode off on the horse, leaving the barge woman shaking her fist at him. He galloped along, thinking how clever he was. By now, he was feeling hungry, and as he passed a hedge, the most delicious smell came floating over it. A gypsy was cooking a stew of rabbit, pheasant, and onions in an iron pot on a fire. Quickly, Toad struck a bargain. He sold the horse in exchange for a few pence and a plate of stew. He was feeling his old self again and began to make up a boastful song about his adventures. While he was singing, "The world has held great heroes, as history books have showed, but never a name to go down to fame compared to Mr. Toad." Then a familiar noise was heard. Along the highway came a motor car, and it was the very one Toad had stolen. Toad pretended to faint, and the car stopped. The passengers took him to be a poor washerwoman and put him in the front seat, where the fresh air would revive him. It was not long before Toad perked up enough to ask a favor. "I've always wanted to see if I could drive a motor car," he said longingly. "Please, let me try." The passengers were very amused to think of a humble washerwoman wanting to drive. "Let her have a go," they said to the chauffeur. Toad drove off, slowly at first, then faster and faster. "Be careful, washerwoman," they cried. "I'm not a washerwoman," said he. "I'm the great, the famous Toad," and he drove faster than ever, terrifying the passengers, until he took a corner too fast and drove straight into a pond. He jumped out and hopped off across the fields, singing another verse of his boastful song, leaving the passengers standing up to their waists in muddy water. The clever men at Oxford know all that is to be known, but none of them knows half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad. But when he looked back, he saw the chauffeur and 2 policemen running after him. Poor Toad puffed along. He was a very fat animal, and they were gaining on him. What a fool he had been, showing off like that. Suddenly, he tripped up. He had come to the riverbank, and splash, he fell into the river. He swam along, gasping, till he came to a hole in the bank. He clutched the edge and looked in. A small, bright thing shone and moved towards him. A face grew up around it, brown and small with whiskers, grave and round with neat ears. It was the water rat. Chapter 9. The Battle for Toad Hall. When Toad had been dried off and given a suit of Ratty's to wear, Rat told him what had happened while he had been away. The wild wooders had taken over Toad Hall. Weasels, ferrets, and stoats were living there, eating Toad's food and drinking his drink, and telling everybody he was never coming back. Toad was all for going up there at once and turning them out. But Ratty explained that they had armed sentries posted and all the entrances were guarded. He and Badger and Mole patrolled the hall every day, and there was no way in. Just then, the two tired, shabby animals entered. The Badger's clothes were covered in mud. He said solemnly, "Welcome home, Toad." "Alas, what am I saying? This is a poor homecoming, unhappy Toad." And he sat down and cut himself a piece of cold pie. But Mole, whose fur was full of bits of hay and straw, danced around Toad joyously and said, "You must have escaped. Oh, clever Toad." At this, Toad began to tell all his adventures and show off to the admiring Mole. "Don't egg him on, Mole," said Ratty. "We have to think what to do next." They all began to talk at once until Badger silenced them. "Be quiet. All of you, he growled. He finished his pie and had a piece of cheese before he spoke again. Toad, you bad, troublesome little animal. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? What do you think your father, my old friend, would have said if he'd known of your goings-on? The toad rolled over on his face on the sofa and began to sob. Never mind that, said Badger. We'll let bygones be bygones. I'll tell you my plan to get Toad Hall back again. There is an underground passage. And the Badger outlined his plan to the eager listeners. The secret passage came up inside Toad Hall in the butler's pantry next to the banqueting hall. That night there was to be a party for the chief weasel. Everyone would be in the banqueting hall having a good time, except for a few sentries outside in the grounds. Badger and his men would creep along the tunnel, armed to the teeth, then come up inside the hall and take the wild wooders by surprise. Badger had a pile of weapons, and Ratty distributed them into 4 little heaps. As he ran from one to the other, he muttered busily, Here's a sword for the rat. Here's a sword for the mole. Here's a sword for the toad. Here's a sword for the badger. Here's a pistol for the rat. Here's a pistol for the mole, and so on, till all the weapons were sorted out. Then they had a supper of baked beans and macaroni cheese. When it was dark, they put on their belts and their pistols and swords and set off for the secret passage. Badger led the way, flourishing a thick stick. They kept stopping in the darkness and bumped into each other several times. This gave Toad, who was last, quite a fright. But soon they could hear the noise of the feast overhead, the stamping of little feet, clinking of glasses, and cheers. Now, boys, all together, said Badger, and they heaved at the trap door. They came up into the butler's pantry and could hear the chief weasel giving a speech of thanks. I should like to say a word about our kind Mr. Toad, he sniggered. Good Toad, modest Toad, honest Toad. Everybody laughed. In return for his hospitality, I have made up a little song about him. Then the chief weasel began to sing a song, a very rude song all about motor cars and prison at the top of his squeaky little voice. Let me get at him, said Toad. Now, now, cried the Badger, and they burst into the banqueting hall, laying about with them and their weapons. My, what a squeaking and a squealing and a screeching filled the air. Terrified weasels dived under the tables. Ferrets rushed madly for the fireplace and got hopelessly stuck in the chimney. The mighty Badger laid about him with his stick. Mole gave a terrible war cry. A mole! A mole! Rat flourished his pistol. Toad, swollen to twice his usual size, went straight for the chief weasel. There were only the 4 of them, but to the wild wooders they seemed like an army. At last the room was clear, and all the weasels fled, squeaking back to the wild wood, except for a few. Mole had given brooms and aprons and a set to tidy up the hall. Chapter 10. The Wanderer's Return. Next day, Toad wanted to give a banquet for his friends and neighbors to celebrate his homecoming. He spent the morning making out a program full of songs, by Toad, and speeches, by Toad, on subjects like our prison system and horse dealing. When his friends saw it, they told him what they thought of him. You must turn over a new leaf, Toad, and stop showing off. No speeches? No speeches. No one little song? Not one little song. Poor Toad. He had to promise to perform. But up in his bedroom, looking in the mirror, he sang his last little song in praise of himself. It was called When the Toad Came Home. The Toad came home. There was panic in the parlor land, howling in the hall. There was crying in the cowshed and shrieking in the stall. When the Toad came home. When the Toad came home. There was smashing in of willow wind, crashing in of a door. There was shivering of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the Toad came home. Bang go the drums. The trumpeters are tooting and the soldiers are saluting. And the cannon they are shooting and the motor cars are hooting as the hero comes. Shout hooray, and let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud in honor of an animal whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's great day. Toad sang this very loudly with expression, and when he came to the end, he sang it all over again. Then he went quietly downstairs to greet his guests. He refused to take any credit for the victory. No, it was Badger's idea. Mole and Rat did most of the fighting, he said modestly. Mole and Rat looked at each other. This was indeed an altered Toad. The jailer's daughter and the engine driver were sent letters of thanks and presents. The barge woman was sent the value of her horse, though Toad protested. The gypsy was sent nothing, as he had done rather well out of the deal. The four friends sometimes took a stroll together in the wild wood of a summer evening. Respectful mother weasels pointed them out to the young ones and told them to behave, or the terrible great gray Badger would get them. This was somewhat unfair to Badger, who was fond of children, but it never failed to make them behave. The end. This concludes our reading for the evening and this book, The Wind and the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Have a good evening. Sleep well. Goodbye.